29 November 1943, Tokyo. Night air salted by the bay, windows filmed with the damp of an early winter storm. In a cramped signals room, the lacquer smell of headphones and hot transformer varnish mixed with cigarette ash, while a petty officer tapped out a transcript from a fading Morse whisper somewhere west of Australia. The traffic was wrong. Not firing solutions, not convoy bearings, postal routing codes, abbreviations that lived in clerks' ledgers, not on an enemy submarine circuit. EFRI ML, PAC FWD, sequences that matched mail sacks, not minefields. By morning, the intercept lay on a Courier-trained staff officer's desk, its pencil notes smeared by his palm. By evening, copies had climbed to the Naval General Staff, an irritation set aside for heavier news from the Gilberts. Days later, the irritation curdled into rumor. In Yokosuka, mess halls, and Tokyo safe houses, men who read other men's secrets murmured that the Americans were using submarines to carry letters and orders beneath the blockade. Captured Allied sailors in late 1943 interrogations reinforced the whisper, microfilmed mail, 16 millimeter. V-mail reduced to ounces, was moving in steel hulls that ranged more than 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. The big Gato and Balao boats turning from ambush to artery when ordered. From Fremantle's tropical heat to the rime of the North Atlantic, packets and reels threaded through periscope-depth darkness to keep commands aligned and crews human in a war that sought to sever both. To admirals raised to see a submarine as blade, not bloodstream, the thought landed like a challenge rather than a curiosity. To understand why the Americans dared it and how doctrine bent until steel hunters became couriers, we must go back, before the Pacific War, to the arguments that defined what a submarine was for. February 1942. The Pacific was collapsing into silence. Manila had fallen. The American garrison on Corregidor was starving in tunnels lit by failing bulbs, and across the steaming archipelagos of the Dutch East Indies, oil fires burned over blackened ports once humming with Allied convoys. What had been a network of airfields and sea lanes now lay in ruin. From San Francisco to Darwin, the cables of communication sagged under absence. Mail that once reached the Philippines in 9 days now vanished entirely, buried beneath Japanese conquests that stretched from Burma to the Solomons. For thousands of men fighting or retreating, the war became not only a contest of weapons, but of isolation. Letters from home, those flimsy lifeblood sheets of connection, simply stopped coming. Families in Iowa or Oregon waited for word from sons whose ships were now sea graves. In Australia, new American bases built from coral and sweat became outposts without voices. The U.S. Navy understood that morale was a weapon, and in 1942 it was running out. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, then rebuilding the Pacific submarine force from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, faced a fleet designed for combat but crippled by distance. The new Gato-class submarines, each capable of cruising over 11,000 nautical miles and remaining submerged for 75 days, were mechanical endurance incarnate, self-contained, invisible, and untraceable. Lockwood's men were learning to stalk Japanese convoys across half an ocean. Yet amid charts of attack approaches, a stranger thought began to circulate through his staff. Could these same submarines carry something gentler? Letters, orders, the fragile paper of connection, through seas the enemy ruled by air? It was a quiet revolution, born of necessity and loneliness. To turn predators into couriers demanded not only fuel and space, but a new mindset, an admission that survival depended on human contact as much as firepower. Thus began the blueprint for a mission that would fuse logistics with longing, to move words through water faster than ships could move men. Spring 1943. Pearl Harbor, beneath the stifling corrugated roofs of the submarine base workshops, the clang of hammers and the hiss of acetylene torches echoed through air thick with diesel and salt. Engineers bent over the hull of USS Narwhal, one of the Navy's largest fleet submarines, sketching blue lines across her torpedo compartment bulkheads. The order from Admiral Lockwood's headquarters was unlike any they had received. Modify the warship not for new weapons, but for letters. Where Mark 14 torpedoes once rested, Sheet metal cradles and bolted racks were welded in place to hold cylindrical containers, each built to survive a depth of 300 feet and the crushing silence of the deep. In those aluminum tubes, sealed in wax and rubber gaskets, would travel more than 2,000 pounds of mail, film reels, coded reports, and the most precious cargo of all, handwritten words from home. At Pearl Harbor and later in Brisbane, machinists designed these cylinders with the precision of ordnance. They were shaped like torpedo ballast shells, anodized to resist corrosion, and magnetically neutral so they would not distort a submarine's compass or sonar. The Office of Naval Communications standardized the entire process under the new designation, Submarine Mail Run. Every pouch received a call sign, every departure a time interval carefully disguised amid regular radio traffic to avoid Japanese direction finding. In the radio rooms, fresh transmitters capable of sending microfilm intelligence in bursts were installed beside depth charge gauges and Morse sets. It was logistics camouflaged as lethality. For the men aboard the Narwhal, the Bowfin, and the Nautilus, the mission's weight was more human than strategic. Delivering a pouch of letters to a beachhead meant carrying morale itself, hope wrapped in canvas. When USS Grayback surfaced off Mindoro in November 1943 and offloaded her sealed canisters to a small PT boat convoy, it marked the quiet birth of the undersea post. What began as an experiment of steel and paper would soon knit together an entire ocean of isolated commands. December 1943, Fremantle. The heat shimmered off the concrete piers where two gray shapes, USS Narwhal and USS Nautilus, lay moored, their decks stacked with burlap sacks and watertight cylinders instead of torpedoes. The men moved quietly under the curving light of dock lamps. Loading canisters stamped FPO 140 San Francisco and marked in red stencil, personal, urgent, confidential. Each pouch carried a lifeline of its own, letters reduced to microfilm, operational orders, and even handwritten notes signed by President Roosevelt for the cut-off garrisons still fighting in the islands. The submarines slipped out under radio silence, diving into the black swells of the Indian Ocean, where every sound could mean detection and death. Days later, after threading through Japanese patrolled straits, Narwhal rose beneath the ragged cliffs of Mindanao. In the dripping dark of a coastal cove, native outriggers appeared, their paddles silent. A single torch blinked twice, the signal agreed upon weeks before. Mail canisters and crates of ammunition passed hand to hand through surf that smelled of fuel and mangrove. Among them were sealed packets addressed to Sea Dr. Wendell Fertig, Mindanao Command. Inside lay the first tangible proof that the United States still lived beyond the horizon. When Fertig read Roosevelt's note, typed, signed, and carried across thousands of miles in a steel tube, he reportedly wept before his men, saying, we are remembered. In the Dutch East Indies, USS Harder repeated the miracle. Surfacing off Timor under a moonless sky, she exchanged encrypted dispatches with Australian commandos and even took aboard outgoing letters folded into oilskin. For the first time since 1942, words were moving both ways through waters the enemy claimed to own. Tokyo's intelligence bureaus caught fragments of strange postal call signs and panicked. New anti-submarine patrols scoured the Celebes Sea, but the mail boats, having delivered their hope, were already gone, fading westward into the unbroken Pacific night. The next stage of the experiment would push even farther, toward the scattered island campaigns, now beginning to turn the tide. January 1944. Yokosuka Naval District. The winter air hung sharp with coal smoke as officers from the Intelligence Bureau filed into a windowless chamber beneath the communications wing. On the long table lay captured papers from guerrilla caches in the Philippines, smudged microfilm reels, torn envelopes, and code fragments stamped U.S. Navy Mail Service. The first decrypted reports from field units seemed too absurd to record. According to interrogated Filipinos, American submarines had surfaced off Mindanao to deliver letters and motion picture film. To the Japanese, it sounded like enemy propaganda, psychological warfare meant to suggest that the United States still had reach in seas Japan claimed as its own. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, head of naval intelligence, dismissed the notion outright. He told his staff that such operations were impossible nonsense. No commander would squander a multi-million-yen fleet submarine to ferry stationary. But over the next weeks, the evidence thickened. Direction-finding stations from Saipan to Ambon detected irregular bursts of Allied traffic timed with suspected submarine departures from Fremantle. Technicians ran the mathematics. A Gato class could indeed cross over 6,000 nautical miles and still have range to return, even carrying up to 50 tons of sealed freight. The conclusion, unthinkable yet undeniable, began to dawn. America was using its submarines not only to destroy convoys, but to bind an ocean together. Then came the humiliation. In February, a Japanese patrol recovered charred microfilm from a destroyed courier base near Davao. Under magnification, the reel bore the clear legend, USS Narwhal Correspondence, Mindanao Sector. The message reached Tokyo like an insult carved in metal. Fukudome's bureau, forced to admit the operation's authenticity, ordered the deployment of new Type 93 depth charges to intercept postal submarines. None were ever confirmed destroyed. Behind official fury lay a deeper unease, an unspoken recognition that the Americans fought with something beyond strategy or machines. They were sustaining faith itself through salt water and steel. By mid-1944, the experiment that had begun in secrecy at Fremantle and Pearl Harbor matured into a full-fledged system the crews affectionately called Operation Mailman. What had once been improvised cargo, letters hidden beside torpedoes, was now an organized lifeline, stretching across half the world's ocean. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Communications map lit up with new routes linking Pearl Harbor, Midway, Brisbane, and Fremantle to the island frontiers of New Guinea, the Marianas, and the newly reclaimed Philippines. More than 30 submarines rotated through the schedule, their missions marked not by sinkings but by deliveries. Inside the Fleet Post Office and the OSS liaison units, clerks and cryptographers turned love letters and top-secret directives into the same compact form. Microfilm. Kodak Recordak cameras clattered night and day, reducing thousands of pages into thin ribbons of acetate weighing less than a pound. Each spool held the words of families, commands, and intelligence briefings, compressed humanity ready for the depths. V-mail letters, reconnaissance photographs, and OSS reports were packed in numbered canisters alongside spare parts and penicillin. A single courier submarine could now carry communications that once filled an entire freighter. At Pearl Harbor, the new Fleet Post Office Annex devised a precise chain of custody, coded routing tags, waterproof seals, and exchange passwords known only to the crews. What had begun as desperation now ran with bureaucratic perfection. In January 1945, USS Sealion II made perhaps the most famous run, 6,000 individual letters from Pearl Harbor to Subic Bay, delivered through mine-strewn waters and returning with captured Japanese codebooks. The effect was transformative. A message that once took 3 months could now reach the front in 3 weeks. Admiral Nimitz himself sent personal thank-you notes through the system, praising our invisible couriers. In Tokyo, those words struck like superstition. No aircraft could fly that far unseen, yet mail from Hawaii reached Mindanao. The Japanese staff began to whisper of ghosts beneath the sea, proof that the Americans commanded not only the surface, but the silence below. Spring 1944. San Francisco, the cavernous halls of the Fleet Post Office thundered with the rhythm of machines. Kodak Recordak cameras ticked like metronomes as clerks fed thousands of letters into the lenses, each page shrinking into a frame no larger than a fingernail. The Post Office Department and the Navy's Bureau of Ships had fused civilian precision with military urgency. What emerged was a new logistical organism, an empire of steel, paper, and distance. Each roll of film, once processed and sealed, was slid into aluminum pressure tubes stamped with routing codes, and bundled for flight aboard long-range B-24 Liberators bound for Pearl Harbor or Brisbane. From there, the mail descended into submarines. metal couriers capable of 11,000-mile circuits through oceans the enemy believed closed. Between 1941 and 1945, America built 288 fleet submarines, Gato, Balao, and Tench classes, each an industrial cathedral of valves, wiring, and sweat. Their range stretched beyond 75 days at sea, their crush depth approaching 400 feet. Fleet oilers, tender ships, and mobile dry docks trailed behind the advance across the Pacific, turning isolated lagoons at Majuro, Guam, and Fremantle into self-sustaining hubs. It was an ecosystem of movement, engineered so that no sailor or soldier, however distant, was forgotten. By late 1944, over 2 million V-mail microframes had passed through this undersea artery. Each reel weighed ounces yet carried entire worlds, letters to children, commands to divisions, and assurances to men who had not seen land for months. The Japanese, who struggled even to maintain postal routes within their shrinking empire, could scarcely comprehend such synchronization. The mail submarines were not only feats of engineering, but symbols of what industrial democracy could become in total war. A civilization that built machines to kill and then taught them, improbably, to deliver hope. January 1945. Fremantle. Humid air pressed against the submarine pens as the USS Narwhal and USS Nautilus prepared for missions unlike any other. Their torpedo rooms were lined not just with warheads, but with watertight mail cylinders stamped FPO 140, Philippines Forward Command. Inside were letters, reconnaissance maps, and even 16mm newsreel film bound for the newly liberated footholds in Mindoro and Leyte. The war had shifted eastward, and as MacArthur's forces clawed their way back across the islands, communication, not conquest, became the lifeline of command. Air routes were still too dangerous, radio traffic too exposed. Only the submarines could thread the blockade unseen. The Narwhal's mission in February carried something more than mail. Among the canisters lay envelopes personally signed by General Douglas MacArthur, addressed to guerrilla commanders who had fought through 3 years of isolation. When the submarine surfaced in the Mindoro Strait under a sky streaked by tracer fire, small motor launches raced out through the phosphorescent surf to receive the sealed pouches. Witnesses later recalled soldiers tearing them open beneath lantern light, letters from wives, children, and a message from MacArthur himself. Your courage has not been forgotten. Some men laughed aloud. Others simply wept. For them, the arrival of paper and ink was the tangible proof of liberation. On the return voyage, the Narwhal carried something just as precious, letters home from men who had not written since 1942. Each page bore the stains of jungle humidity and gunpowder. As Manila fell in February, these postal submarines emerged from secrecy into legend. In the ruined post offices of the city, Allied troops found mountains of unopened mail, Japanese and American alike, mute monuments to longing delayed by war. The undersea post had outlived empire, delivering not just words, but the memory of connection that the sea could never drown. In the vast machinery of war, amid the columns of tonnage sunk, fuel consumed and convoys destroyed, another record existed, one that no chart could measure. It was written in the letters, sealed within the hulls of submarines, carried through pressure and darkness to men who had nearly forgotten the sound of their own names. These envelopes bore more than words. Birth announcements from wives who had given birth alone, final farewells from fathers who would never see peace, coded instructions to families evacuated halfway across the world. Within the metal silence of the Narwhal and Nautilus, these fragile papers became a second kind of ammunition, one that kept hearts alive when strategy alone could not. Commander William Bull, right of the Narwhal, later recalled the moment his crew opened a sealed bag labeled Hospital, Manila. Inside were letters to wounded POWs, some of whom had been presumed dead for months. We realized, he wrote, that every mile we steamed was keeping someone alive in spirit. The same boat that delivered these messages also carried film reels of reconnaissance targets, images of destruction packed beside messages of life. It was war and memory fused together, a paradox that only the men beneath the waves seemed to understand. To the Japanese, whose submarine doctrine demanded sacrifice above survival, such missions appeared sentimental, an indulgence unworthy of a weapon of war. But therein lay the difference. American submariners risked the same depth charges and blackwater patrols not only for destruction, but for connection. Each letter run reaffirmed what they fought to preserve, the humanity that total war tried to erase. As 1945 drew toward its terrible conclusion and Japan's empire crumbled inward, the undersea mail still moved, unbroken, invisible, proof that even in war's darkest depths, empathy could navigate by its own light. By the spring of 1945, the undersea mail service had evolved beyond morale. It had become strategy itself. What began as a lifeline of letters now pulsed as a hidden artery of command, carrying intelligence too vital to risk by radio or air. Where once coded transmissions invited interception and aircraft couriers fell to zero fighters, submarines now crossed those same waters unseen, their cargo measured not in pounds, but in consequences. Within the steel confines of the USS Nautilus, Craval, and Sealion II traveled secret maps of Japanese shipping lanes, reconnaissance negatives from Luzon, and field reports from OSS agents hidden in the Philippines. These were not sentimental missions anymore. They were operational veins feeding the brain of the Pacific Command. At Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers found their timelines transformed. Reports that once required months to reach Honolulu now arrived within weeks, sometimes days. Analysts credited the submarine courier system with cutting planning delays by as much as 40%, enough to influence the tempo of major campaigns from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa. Each returning boat brought not only mail, but blueprints of enemy defenses, fragments of captured codes, and photographs of beaches soon to bear the weight of invasion. For Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had once imagined submarines as hunters, it was vindication. They were now instruments of communication, the sinew connecting fleets, bases, and commanders across 7,000 miles of contested ocean. To Tokyo, this unseen network defied comprehension. Japanese signals divisions recorded Allied awareness that bordered on omniscience. They could not locate the source because it traveled in silence, beneath detection, beyond doctrine. The ocean that once separated continents had turned traitor. It no longer divided the Allies but joined them. In those last months of war, the sea itself had become a messenger, and the submarines its ghostly couriers of victory. Not every voyage of the undersea post ended in celebration. The Pacific kept its share of secrets, and among them were submarines that never returned. In June 1944, USS Herring, carrying dispatch films and encrypted orders from Fremantle to Pearl Harbor, vanished in the Kurile Islands after sinking 2 Japanese merchantmen. No distress signal was ever received. The Japanese later claimed to have sunk a submarine off Matsuwa with a string of depth charges. The description matched Herring's last known position. Weeks later, USS Runner, also serving as a courier, loaded with microfilm canisters and sealed diplomatic pouches, was declared missing en route from Australia. For the families waiting at Mare Island and Portsmouth, the silence that followed was absolute. The Navy's public statements said only presumed lost, but within the Bureau of Ships, officers already understood. The mail had gone down with the men. Even the submarines that survived fought their own enemies: moisture, mold, and pressure. Aluminum mail tubes sweated under condensation. Film emulsions warped in the tropical heat. Crews improvised humidity control with silica gel desiccants and makeshift ventilators rigged from spare parts. Despite the hazards, volunteers for courier missions never ran short. Many sailors said these runs offered a rare sense of purpose, proof that their boats carried something more enduring than explosives. Japanese countermeasures intensified through late 1944. Patrol aircraft dropped hydrophone buoys in the Salib Sea, and destroyers swept coastal channels with new listening gear. None succeeded. One captured Japanese analyst after the war admitted that interception was virtually impossible. Yet inside the U.S. Navy, quiet debates persisted. Each courier load reduced torpedo capacity and patrol range, an invisible trade-off between sentiment and strategy. Still, for those who served, the answer was never in doubt. Every letter delivered was a victory measured not in tonnage, but in faith, a reminder that even in darkness, humanity could find its way home. August 1945. The Pacific at last exhaled. From Guam to Subic Bay, the submarines that had once carried war orders now surfaced bearing a different kind of message, the news of peace. On their decks, sailors watched as harbor cranes swung over the water, unloading canvas mailbags swollen with letters written in the final, trembling days before Japan's surrender. The USS Cobia, returning from her last courier patrol, logged that her cargo was heavier than torpedoes. Inside the sacks lay relief, disbelief and grief in equal measure, letters announcing the end of fighting, the birth of children never met, and the names of friends who would not return. On September 2nd, as formal surrender papers were signed aboard the USS Missouri, the Navy's Fleet Post Office issued one final dispatch declaring it the last day of war mail. That same week, submarines at Guam distributed thousands of homeward-bound messages to crews waiting for transport back to the United States. Many of the men who read those letters had been at sea since 1942, their families now 3 years older, their world irreversibly changed. For them, the arrival of a simple envelope meant closure, the war distilled into handwriting. In the ruins of Manila, captured Japanese officers were shown intercepted Allied letters, soldiers joking about baseball scores, birthdays, and coffee rations. To them, such ordinary words were incomprehensible. Their own correspondence networks had long since collapsed under bombing and blockade. The contrast was painful and unmistakable. One side had sustained its spirit through communication, the other had fought alone in silence. When Admiral Charles Lockwood reviewed his final submarine reports that autumn, he underlined the line marked mail run operations and wrote in the margin only 2 words: worth everything. The oceans that once divided enemies were now the same roads leading both home. In the years after victory, the story of the undersea post faded quietly into classified archives and veterans' reunions. By 1952, when the Navy finally declassified fragments of Operation Mailman, historians discovered a system far ahead of its time, an early prototype for the secure communication networks that would later define the Cold War. The lessons of those wartime mail runs shaped new technologies. The pressure-proof microfilm containers became the model for submarine reconnaissance capsules, and the coded routing systems evolved into the encrypted message pods carried aboard nuclear submarines prowling beneath the Arctic ice. What had begun as a desperate improvisation in 1943 had become a foundation for the age of atomic secrecy. Yet beyond the machinery, the legacy was human. Many wartime submariners, men who had once balanced torpedoes beside letters, spoke of those missions as their proudest duty. They remembered not the explosions, but the moments when a hand passed a mailbag through the surf, when words reached men who had been forgotten by the world. Civilian maritime historians, more focused on tonnage and tactics, often overlooked this emotional thread, but within naval circles it lingered as a quiet legend. Proof that technology could serve empathy as much as aggression. Even Japanese naval scholars, studying captured American records in the 1960s, wrote of their respect for the dual soul of the U.S. submarine fleet, machines that could both kill and comfort. In naval academies from Annapolis to Yokosuka, the mail runs became case studies in creative adaptation, how necessity forced innovation, and how compassion could coexist with calculation. Today, the torpedoes of that era lie rusting in museums, but the letters endure in archives, thin sheets of humanity that once crossed the ocean sealed in steel, bearing witness to the war that taught the world connection could travel even beneath the waves. Today, in quiet museum halls at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane, behind glass cases fogged by age, sit relics of an almost forgotten miracle, the mail tubes and microfilm reels once carried through darkness by American submarines. Their aluminum surfaces are pitted by salt, their seals stiff with time, yet each one still bears the stenciled codes of Operation Mailman, proof that steel once served not only to destroy, but to connect. The Japanese admirals, who once called the idea impossible nonsense, could never have imagined the truth, that across an ocean they claimed to rule. Words had traveled unharmed through silence and pressure, defying both distance and despair. In those years of chaos, men beneath the sea fought not just for victory, but for memory. Every letter sealed, every microfilm loaded into a watertight tube, carried the same fragile promise that the human voice could outlast the noise of war. Beneath thousands of tons of steel and the crushing weight of depth, courage took the shape of communication. The ocean, once a frontier of isolation, had become a messenger of humanity, and perhaps that was the truest victory of all, not measured in ships sunk or enemies defeated, but in connections preserved. The same waves that swallowed fleets now whisper their echoes. Somewhere, deep within the Pacific's silence, a few last letters still rest, messages of hope never delivered, yet forever afloat in memory, speaking softly across time.